Today we got definitive evidence that the fire at the Norfolk Southern rail line in East Palestine, Ohio was a bigger deal than they said. At last Wednesday's press conference with the governor, a reporter asked what chemicals were of concern, and this is what the representative from the railroad said.
Obviously the vinyl chloride that,
vinyl chloride.
We had to burn, and then a little bit of lube oil,
non-haz lube oil, a little bit.
The butyl acrylate that is what a lot of what we're gathering.
So today, the 12th, 4 days later, the EPA released the manifest sent to them yesterday from Norfolk Southern Railroad. This document can be downloaded directly from the EPA's website from the link in my bio. I brought up this non-haz lube oil before because just because it's non-hazardous doesn't mean that it's okay to spill it into the ground. So he said a little bit. Well, their train manifests here says they lost almost 2 full loads. These classes of train cars can carry up to 30,000 gallons. I have another video posted right before this that went into more things that were listed on this list but never previously mentioned. So we know that there have been tens of thousands of gallons of petroleum oil spilled. The question is, how much of it burned? We also know that they've been using vac trucks and skimmers to collect more material, but how much have they caught? 1 gallon of petroleum oil can pollute up to 1 million gallons of water. It's going to be really important for us to find out exactly what those petroleum oils were, because most petroleum oils have additives added to them that modify certain characteristics of the product. There are tons of different chemicals that are used for this purpose, but some of them are those forever chemicals, PFAS, that you've heard about. They don't break down in nature, and they can be harmful to humans even in very small amounts. It can cause developmental issues, immune issues, cancer. What this document shows us is there's kind of 3 levels to this disaster. There was the initial fire, the intentional fire to prevent the explosion of the vinyl chloride tanks, then an oil spill. A lot of people feel like there's not enough information being disclosed about the train derailment in East Palestine, Ohio. Now, I want you guys to understand that the amount of information that we are getting at the speed that we are getting it is almost unprecedented. I started studying industrial disasters in engineering school and continued to do so throughout my career as an engineer and designer, because a really good way to become a better designer and engineer is to understand what goes wrong and how things go wrong. Somebody I love reached out to me and asked what they thought about this because it was directly affecting her mother. I thought it was really important to give context around the specifics of the event and the aftermath. A lot of the documentation that's produced after disasters like this from organizations like the EPA or the responsible party like the railroad are written by people who have a lot of technical experience. So sometimes it takes a really wide knowledge base to really understand what these documents mean. And you need to have some fundamental understanding of physics and chemistry and industry just to be able to understand what these reports even mean. My focus has not been to report a story, but just to help provide context so people can make informed decisions. When you look historically at these disasters, they all kind of play out in the same ways. But this one is starting to play out different, and I think that's because when people understand the context around what's going on and ask the right questions, they can get different results. There's a link in my bio that goes to the EPA's website where you can download and see all of the public documents that have been made available about this derailment. But I want to show you what that same page looks like for another derailment that happened in the same region, this one in May of 2020. In this incident, 17 Norfolk Southern rail cars derailed into a creek that's a tributary to the Allegheny River. There were multiple train cars carrying petroleum distillates and plastic pellets that spilled into the stream. This is what it looks like. It's just 4 press statements just describing what happened, and a couple paragraphs about the cleanup. Now, I can't even begin to imagine how scary and frustrating this is for the people of East Palestine, but I think that it's important to acknowledge that this is starting to play out differently than most disasters, and I think that's because people are asking the right questions. These days with so much going on, it's really easy to feel powerless, but I think in this specific instance, people actually have a lot of power, and there's still a lot more questions that I think people need answers for, and a lot of that revolves around the water. But because people were asking the right questions, like what are the specific chemicals that were involved in the train derailment, it led to a full disclosure of at least what they tell us is their manifest. With that knowledge, we were able to learn that there was a major petroleum spill, letting us know that there really are serious concerns about the soil and water, both of which we're still in the phase that something can be done about it. Because sometimes these kinds of manifests don't show up until lawsuits are filed years later, and the contamination problems are unfixable. For everyone coming to me for content about East Palestine and everyone sharing my videos, I please implore you to stop sharing old information. The first video that I posted, which is the most viral, has tons of information that is not incorrect, but it's outdated and not really relevant anymore. By all estimations, all the hydrochloric acid is gone. I do think that the evacuation zone and shelter-in-place order zone should have been bigger, and I suspect that in the reports, they'll agree. But that info is a week old. The vinyl chloride is most likely all gone. Our concerns right now are the petroleum, the 2-EHA, and the ethyl glycol monobutyl, because they still haven't been accounted for. Also, the butyl acrylates. I'm working on a video digging into the remediation plans and some big red flags that I see in it. But guys, you guys have to stop sharing this old content. It's turning into misinformation at this point. Now, I'm really at a challenge because part of me wants to delete that video, but I feel like deleting that video will only just further lead into disinformation. So I just need everyone, if you see these old videos talking about the acid cloud, please let people know that that's old information and please stop sharing it. Especially journalists. This information's a week old and it's outdated. There's been a lot of questions and misinformation around the controlled release. When they punctured holes in the sides of these tanks to let the material vent out of it under pressure and be burned, resulting in that big black cloud. Now, from a hazardous material and chemistry standpoint, burning it was the right thing to do. It was the best option. But I've said before that I think what was going to come out was in the postmortem analysis of this, we were going to find out that the modeling was not done right and there wasn't great communication, as well as issues around the controlled release happening over an hour after they were scheduled to, with the railroad themselves acknowledging that getting it done before the atmospheric conversion was really important, so they didn't stay in the lower part of the atmosphere. But it happened much later, and the inversion did happen, and all that stuff was stuck in the atmosphere. Now, I have a lot of reasons why I suspected their modeling was wrong, and I'll have to make a longer video about that because it has to deal with their modeling software. But in this letter addressed to the CEO of Norfolk Southern from Governor Josh Shapiro of Pennsylvania, Norfolk Southern gave inaccurate information and conflicting modeling about the impact of the controlled release that made protective action decision-making more difficult in the immediate aftermath of the derailment. The point that I'm trying to demonstrate here is that these things, unfortunately, are not unusual and they do play out a certain way. And by you learning about how these play out and who lies or misleads us, who has most of the control, and who is actually supposed to be in charge, helps us ask the right questions to fix these things, so push for the right things to prevent them in the future. And another short update, Jamie Baker from WTOV, I think that's in Steubenville, she just reported that Norfolk Southern is not attending the meeting tonight in East Palestine. They said that they have concerns about their employees' safety. Only if there was some way to meet remotely, like a camera on the internet. But it's weird that Norfolk Southern is all of a sudden worried about their employees when they're not worried about them when they're operating trains. One of the issues that's come up for people in town in East Palestine who've been affected by this but are outside the 1 mile radius, they're finding that no one's really offering them support, at least from the railroad. Basically, they're claiming that beyond 1 mile, they didn't do anything or have any effect. But when you look at this report, this is the Remedial Action Work Plan from Arcadis. They are a contractor based in Holland that does these kinds of cleanups. You see that they have containment dams and aeration pumps outside of the 1 mile. What aeration does is it takes water out of these creeks and streams, pumps it through pumps, and then sprays it back over. The idea is it allows any VOCs in the water to evaporate out. But if they have containment dams there and they have aeration, that means that there's pollution there. And by using the aeration, it also means that those VOCs that they're pulling out of the water are evaporating at those points. They also have boom containment outside of the 1 mile. So how can you say that the effective zone is 1 mile when your own cleanup efforts are outside of that 1 mile? There's a lot more to go over out of the remedial action plan, but the other thing that you should look for is all the places where it says like practicable or feasible. These words are used very intentionally. The way I see it, the railroad came in and made a mess in the town. It should be up to the town to decide what's feasible, not the railroad. Since I started talking about the Norfolk Southern train derailment in East Palestine, Ohio, there's been more and more attention and more coverage looking into this disaster. This has also made it harder for me to be able to not only sift through information, but to verify information. I've received thousands of DMs and emails, but I'm looking at everything. I'm looking at every video that you send me, and I'm looking at every piece of documentation I can find. But because of just the sheer volume of information, it's taking me a lot of time to be able to verify things to a level that I feel comfortable sharing them. Especially because I started this with 80,000 followers, and now I have over 200. I've also heard from hundreds of people about how much they trust me on this topic, so I take that trust with a lot of responsibility. Updates might seem slow at times, but know that there's a reason for it. Additionally, just as more time passes, there's more and more things that we have to consider. I think it's easy to see how this whole situation has gotten more and more complex every day. And because of that, over the past couple days, I've been turning to well-respected experts in their field. People with really in-depth, specialized knowledge, education, and experiences. Help not only dig deeper into some of these subjects, but also give you somebody else to listen to. These are people that I've known both from my personal and professional lives, as well as other people that I've met through TikTok. And some people that I've gotten to get familiar with because of my coverage of this event. I just know that there are a lot of people in East Palestine that don't have access to the experts that they want to hear from. And it seems most people are really not satisfied with the answers that they got on Wednesday. In the coming days and weeks, you're going to see me having conversations with and featuring a lot of other online creators, but other just specialists in their fields to help try to explain more of what's going on to people who are interested. Unfortunately, especially for the people directly affected, there's a lot of knowledge and understanding that needs to be had to be able to properly navigate the rest of this cleanup and recovery. I had brought it up before that this was going to be an issue that people were going to try to make a partisan issue. And unfortunately, over the past couple of days, we've really seen a lot of this, but mostly outside of the community. But what I've also seen is inside of East Ohio and Western Pennsylvania, people are staying united over this issue, not letting people divide the community with distractions. If you've been following me for information about the Norfolk Southern disaster in East Palestine, Ohio, you've heard me mention how I think COVID-19 is going to play a part of it. I've been studying industrial disasters for a long time, and part of that is looking at the litigation. One consistent theme that you'll see in all of the litigation concerning industrial disasters is having a hard time being able to pinpoint the health problems or the symptoms to the disaster itself. This gives the defendants, the responsible parties in these disasters, a lot of places to raise scientific and medical doubts. Lots of symptoms can be attributed to a lot of things. And I've already seen messages from people in East Palestine who are being told by the specialists on the hotline that the railroad gave them that their symptoms are most likely COVID. But instead of me telling you why I think that this is important and significant and what I think that people need to do, I'm going to pass it on to one of my friends, Dr. Rubin.
A lot of the symptoms of acute exposure to these hazardous chemicals found at the train derailment site in East Palestine, Ohio, actually overlap that we see with COVID-19. And so in Columbiana County, where East Palestine, Ohio is located, the CDC estimates that the transmission level is moderate, and in some of the surrounding counties, it's substantial to high. So it's not that hard for people to blame COVID-19 for some of these symptoms when actually the hazardous chemicals may come into play. So in order to help rule some of these things out and clarify it, you should get a medical evaluation that includes a PCR test for COVID-19. Not a home test or a rapid test, but you want a PCR test because that's the most accurate test to help rule out COVID-19.
The thing that I want people to understand, especially those directly affected around East Palestine, East Ohio, and Western Pennsylvania, is it doesn't really matter how you feel about COVID. It doesn't matter how you feel about vaccines. It doesn't matter how you feel about Fauci. None of that matters. It's clear that the railroad is going to try to blame symptoms on COVID. Again, it doesn't matter what you think of COVID, but they will be able to bring up plenty of experts, doctors and scientists who will sit on stand and say, yes, it is possible that the symptoms that people experience could be COVID. The words possible and could are very important here, because the way our legal system works, the railroad doesn't need to prove that your symptoms were from COVID. They just need to be able to put enough doubt in place against the argument that it wasn't COVID. Because we're still in an active pandemic, we actually have a lot of tools that people can use to combat this now. The railroad is saying that symptoms are caused by COVID. The only tool that people have that will stand up in court is a negative PCR test. You can also think whatever you want about COVID tests and PCR tests in particular. I guarantee if you go look at all the litigation from all the chemical disasters that have happened in the United States over the past 100 years, you'll understand why the PCR test is the only tool that people are going to have to use in courts against the railroad. It really doesn't matter what you think. I am just telling you that this is how it's going to play out in court. And if you have symptoms and your doctor or your attorney have not encouraged you to go get a PCR test for COVID, I would ask them how familiar they are with the litigation around industrial disasters. And it doesn't even necessarily have to be a negative COVID test, because if enough people in the community get COVID tests, period, all of that data can build a model to again help disprove the railroad's narrative that these symptoms are caused by COVID. Not just for one person, but for the whole community. So it's not just important that individuals get PCR tests for COVID, it's important that the whole community does. That way, even people who end up having COVID during this period still have a tool to use against the railroad in court. And for those who don't believe me, instead of just jumping in my comments right now, go do some research and look at how the litigation has played out historically in this country over these industrial disasters. you'll see that people are going to need every single tool possible to try to poke holes in the railroad story.